The crowbar slipped against the rust-sealed door frame, and 31-year-old Elena Marquez felt the metal scrape across her palm hard enough to draw blood. She stepped back, breathing hard in the December cold, staring at the sealed door on the second floor of the Ashford and Sons funeral home. The door that had been welded shut for 43 years, according to the county property records. The door that every contractor she'd consulted had warned her to leave alone, to seal behind drywall, and forget existed. Blood dripped from her hand onto the dusty floor, and she thought about the eviction notice that had started all of this, the notice that had been taped to her apartment door 9 weeks ago with the efficiency of a death sentence. That had been in October, in Philadelphia, where Elena had spent 7 years building her architectural restoration business from a one-person operation into something almost sustainable. She'd been grossing $73,000 annually, enough to cover her studio apartment in Fishtown at $1,450 monthly, her business insurance, her equipment costs, and her student loan payments of $840 per month for the degree in historic preservation she'd earned from Temple University. Not comfortable, but surviving. Making progress. The building sale had blindsided everyone. The new owner, a development corporation called Apex Urban Holdings, had purchased the entire block, 8 residential buildings, with plans for luxury conversion. The eviction notices went out simultaneously to all 147 tenants, citing renovations requiring full vacancy. 60 days notice, legally sufficient in Pennsylvania, but devastating in a rental market where one-bedrooms started at $1,800 and landlords required credit scores above 700, which Elena had, and income verification showing rent at less than 30% of gross earnings, which eliminated almost everything in her price range. She'd contacted 7 tenant advocacy organizations. All confirmed the eviction was legal. She'd applied to 32 apartments in 6 weeks. 5 rejected her for insufficient income ratio. 12 never responded. 15 had wait lists of over 100 applicants. The attorney she'd consulted, $300 for a 2-hour consultation she paid with a credit card, had been sympathetic but direct. Philadelphia's housing crisis meant legal evictions were nearly impossible to fight. Her best option was to expand her search radius, look at suburbs, consider roommates. By Thanksgiving, Elena had $11,200 in savings, her tools and equipment loaded into her 2011 Toyota Tacoma, and nowhere to go. She'd been sleeping in her truck in the parking lot of a Planet Fitness, using the membership for showers, working from coffee shops when she could get Wi-Fi, trying to maintain client communications while her entire life collapsed. Too much money for emergency housing assistance. Not enough for any permanent solution in the greater Philadelphia area. The email from the estate attorney in Ashford, Pennsylvania had arrived on her phone while she was parked outside a Wawa at 2 in the morning, eating a cold sandwich and calculating how long she could survive like this. The subject line, Estate of Margaret Haywood, Property Inheritance. Margaret Haywood had been Elena's great-aunt on her mother's side, a woman Elena had met exactly twice, both times at family funerals when Elena was a child. The email explained that Margaret had passed away at 94 in a nursing home in Lancaster, and that Elena had been named as sole beneficiary of Margaret's property, the former Ashford and Sons funeral home at 847 Maple Street, Ashford, Pennsylvania, purchased by Margaret in 1981 and unoccupied since. Assessed value, $34,000. Property taxes current through December. The building had been condemned in 2006 for code violations and was zoned commercial, unsuitable for residential conversion, without extensive permits and renovations estimated at $200,000 minimum. There was a note from the attorney. Property is in severe disrepair. Recommend sale. As is, or demolition. Town has expressed interest in purchase for $15,000 for parking lot development. Accept inheritance or disclaim within 30 days. Elena had driven to Ashford the next day, 90 minutes west into Pennsylvania coal country. Population 2,800, a town that looked like it had started dying in 1970 and never quite finished. The funeral home stood on the corner of Maple and 3rd, a 3-story Victorian structure with peeling paint, boarded windows, and a foundation that had settled unevenly, giving the whole building a slight tilt. The front doors were chained. The sign, Ashford and Sons Funeral Home, EST 1924, hum at an angle from one remaining bolt. The interior was worse. Water damage from roof leaks had destroyed the third-floor ceiling. The first-floor chapel smelled of mold and rot. The embalming room in the basement had flooded, leaving 2 inches of stagnant water. The heating system was shot. The electrical system hadn't been code compliant since 1995, and the plumbing was cast iron from the 1940s, mostly corroded through. But the bones were solid. The structure was built from Pennsylvania fieldstone and old-growth lumber, balloon-framed in a way nobody constructed buildings anymore. The windows, beneath the boards, were original wavy glass. The staircase was hand-carved walnut. The property sat on a quarter-acre corner lot, with parking for 20 vehicles and a small carriage house out back. Elena had walked through with the attorney and the town's building inspector, listening to the litany of problems, and done her calculations. With her tools and skills, she could handle maybe 40% of the restoration work herself. The critical systems, roof, electrical, plumbing, would require $80,000 minimum, money she didn't have. But if she lived here while working, if she took on contract jobs in the area, if she documented the restoration and built it into her business portfolio, maybe, you'd have to be crazy. The building inspector had said, not unkindly. This place has been rotting for 20 years. Even if you got it livable, what would you do with a funeral home? Town's barely hanging on as it is. Elena had accepted the inheritance that afternoon. Now, 6 weeks later, with her savings down to $8,940 after emergency roof repairs and a used propane furnace, she stood in front of the sealed second-floor door with a crowbar and questions that wouldn't stop multiplying. The funeral home's records, what remained in the water-damaged office, showed the second-floor viewing room had been sealed in 1981, the same year Margaret had purchased the building. Every other room was accessible, but this one had been welded shut, the door frame reinforced with steel plates. Elena wedged the crowbar into the gap again, this time bracing her weight differently, and felt something give. Metal groaned. The seal cracked with a sound like ice breaking, and cold air rushed out. Air that smelled sterile, preserved, completely different from the rest of the building's decay. The door swung inward, and Elena stepped into a room that had been untouched for 43 years, her flashlight beam cutting through darkness that seemed to resist the light. What she found there would change everything. The room was pristine. While the rest of the funeral home had deteriorated into water damage and rot, this second-floor space was frozen in 1981, burgundy carpet still rich in color, wood paneling gleaming under Elena's flashlight, brass fixtures polished to a mirror shine. The air was temperature-controlled, which meant power was flowing to this room specifically, through lines Elena hadn't discovered in any of her electrical inspections. Someone had maintained this space, had kept it sealed and perfect, for more than 4 decades. 21 filing cabinets lined the east wall, all locked. A large desk dominated the center of the room, and on that desk sat a leather journal, a ring of small keys, and a letter with Elena's name written in shaking handwriting across the envelope. She opened the letter with hands that trembled in the cold. The date was from 3 months before Margaret's death. Elena, I followed your work online. Your restoration projects show you understand that buildings hold stories worth preserving. What I sealed in this room is a different kind of preservation, evidence I collected over 39 years of my career as a forensic accountant, evidence that powerful people wanted destroyed. In 1981, I was hired to audit the Ashford Mining Company during bankruptcy proceedings. What I discovered was systematic fraud, workers' compensation claims denied through falsified medical reports, pension funds embezzled, safety violations covered up through bribed inspections. 17 men died in the 1979 mine collapse that the company claimed was unavoidable. My investigation proved it was negligence, that management knew about the structural failures for 6 months and chose production over repair costs. I compiled everything: financial records, internal memos, testimony from 12 engineers who were willing to speak if protected. I took the evidence to the state attorney general. 2 weeks later, my apartment burned down. The fire marshal ruled it accidental, but my files were specifically targeted. I salvaged what I could and disappeared. I bought this funeral home, a building nobody wanted, in a town where I could watch who came and went, and I sealed this evidence in the one room where nobody would think to look. I've spent 43 years waiting for the right moment, for someone who couldn't be bought or intimidated. The statute of limitations on the financial crimes expired, But the records prove what was done. The mining company executives, 3 of them are still alive, still wealthy, still respected. The families of the dead workers never received justice. You can give it to them. Margaret. Elena sank into the desk chair, the letter crumpling in her grip. She opened the filing cabinets with the keys Margaret had left. Inside were thousands of documents in acid-free folders, each meticulously labeled. Financial statements showing $4.2 million embezzled from pension funds between 1974 and 1979. Internal memoranda from mine executives discussing the South Shaft's instability and deciding repair costs were prohibitive. Falsified safety inspection reports with original and altered versions side by side. Testimony transcripts from workers who reported structural concerns and were subsequently fired. The bottom drawer of the largest cabinet contained something else. A list of the 17 men who died in the 1979 collapse, their ages, their families' names, and the compensation each family had been denied. A total of $8.9 million in legitimate claims that Ashford Mining Company had rejected through fraud and legal manipulation. Elena spent 3 days in that room, photographing every document, building a digital archive, cross-referencing names against current records. 12 of the 17 dead miners' families still had surviving relatives in the Ashford area. The 3 living executives, Robert Ashford, Thomas Kincaid, and William Voss, had left the mining industry after Ashford Mining's bankruptcy in 1982, but they'd left wealthy. Ashford owned a consulting firm in Pittsburgh, worth an estimated $30 million. Kincaid sat on the board of 2 energy companies. Voss had invested his money in real estate and lived in a waterfront mansion in Annapolis. The town of Ashford had never recovered from the mine's closure. The population had been 8,400 in 1979. Now it was barely 2,800, the downtown mostly empty storefronts. The school system consolidated with 3 neighboring districts. The mining families who'd stayed had worked service jobs, driven an hour to factories in Lancaster, survived on Social Security and disability payments for injuries the company had never properly compensated. Elena found a lawyer on her 4th day back online, a public interest attorney named David Ortiz, who specialized in corporate fraud cases and worked for a nonprofit called the Pennsylvania Workers' Justice Project. She sent him a 5-page summary and 12 sample documents. He called her within 2 hours. "Where did you get this?" His voice was tight, controlled. "This is documented evidence of fraud that would have put people in prison if it had been prosecuted 40 years ago. From my great-aunt, who was the forensic accountant who discovered it. She's been dead 3 months. I inherited her building, and the evidence was sealed inside. Is it still usable?" The criminal statutes have expired, but this opens pathways for civil action. Wrongful death claims can be refiled if new evidence emerges showing fraud suppressed the original cases. The pension fund embezzlement is documented enough that we could go after the executives' personal assets for restitution. This is 40 years of justice that was stolen. If you're willing to be the face of this, to testify about the evidence chain, we can bring this to the families and the media. What do the families get? Realistically, national attention, vindication, and potentially significant settlements if we can pierce the corporate protections and go after personal assets. The executives tried to bury this. We make them pay for that. Literally. Elena made her decision in the sealed room on the 2nd floor, surrounded by her great-aunt's 43 years of silent testimony. Do it. Whatever you need from me. The story broke 3 weeks later, first in the Harrisburg Patriot News, then picked up by the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Washington Post. Hidden evidence reveals decades-old mining fraud. Executives escaped justice while workers' families suffered. Elena was photographed in front of the funeral home, holding one of Margaret's ledgers, her face serious and exhausted. The article detailed the 17 deaths, the falsified reports, the embezzled pensions, and the forensic accountant who'd sacrificed her career and safety to preserve the truth. The response was immediate and visceral. The families of the dead miners, elderly widows, middle-aged children, grandchildren who'd grown up in poverty because of stolen compensation, came forward with their stories. 6 television crews descended on Ashford. David Ortiz filed a civil suit against the 3 living executives, seeking $47 million in damages, restitution, and punitive penalties. Elena's phone rang constantly. News interviews, documentary producers, lawyers requesting access to the documents. She coordinated everything from the funeral home's first floor, which she'd converted into a makeshift office, still wearing her work clothes, and heating the space with portable propane heaters. 2 months after the story broke, on a morning in late February when the funeral home's ancient radiators finally started working after Elena had spent 4 days replumbing the boiler system, a woman appeared at the front door. She was perhaps 70, thin, with steel gray hair and eyes that looked carved from stone. Her name was Patricia Novak, and her father had died in the 1979 collapse when she was 27 years old. They gave us $15,000, Patricia said, standing in what had been the funeral home's chapel, now stripped to bare walls and subflooring. For a man who worked 31 years in those mines, who died because they were too cheap to fix a shaft they knew was failing. $15,000 and a letter saying it was an unavoidable accident. We knew it was a lie. Everyone knew. But we couldn't prove it, and we couldn't afford lawyers, and they had everything: money, connections, politicians. They waited us out. Figured we'd die or give up. Elena showed her the documents, her father's name in Margaret's careful handwriting, his compensation claim, the memo from Robert Ashford himself discussing the south shaft's instability 2 months before the collapse. Patricia's hands shook as she touched the paper. Someone knew. All these years, someone had proof. My great-aunt knew. She spent 43 years keeping it safe, waiting for the right time. Why now? Why you? Elena looked around the gutted chapel, at the exposed beams and the water-stained walls, at the building people had called worthless. Because I had nothing left to lose. And because she trusted me to finish what she started. The settlement negotiations took 9 months, and Elena lived through all of them in the funeral home, working construction during the day and reviewing documents with David Ortiz at night. The building transformed around her as winter turned to spring, then summer. New electrical system installed, plumbing replaced, roof sealed and reinforced. She did most of the labor herself, documenting the restoration and photographs that she used to attract new clients in the surrounding counties. Word spread about the woman who'd restored the old Ashford funeral home while breaking open a 40-year-old fraud case. She started getting calls from historical societies, from property owners who'd written off their buildings as hopeless. By August, she had 6 restoration projects under contract and a waiting list. She'd hired 2 apprentices from the local community college, young people who were desperate for skilled work and willing to learn. The funeral home's first floor became her office and workshop. The second floor, she converted into her apartment. The sealed viewing room, now her bedroom, kept pristine and unchanged except for a bed and dresser, a reminder of what secrets could be preserved through stubbornness and faith. The settlement was finalized in October, 1 year and 3 weeks after Elena had accepted the inheritance. Robert Ashford, Thomas Kincaid, and William Voss agreed to a combined payment of $31 million to be distributed among the 17 families, approximately $1.8 million per family, 43 years late, but finally delivered. The executives admitted no wrongdoing in the settlement language, but the documented evidence was entered into public record, permanently attached to their names. Patricia Novak received her family's share on a Friday afternoon, $1,823,000, split among her and her 3 siblings. She came to the funeral home afterward, standing in the restored chapel that Elena had converted into a community meeting space, and cried without shame. My mother died 15 years ago, still angry, still poor, Patricia said. She never got to see this. But my father did, wherever he is. He knows someone finally told the truth. Elena sat with her in the chapel, in the building that was supposed to have been worthless, and felt the weight of the years settle into something that might eventually become peace. She'd been evicted, made homeless, stripped of everything she'd built in Philadelphia. She'd inherited a condemned funeral home in a dying town and a great-aunt's 43-year-old act of defiance. And somehow, impossibly, she'd turned those losses into something that mattered. The restoration business thrived. By the end of the year, Elena had enough contracts to hire 4 full-time employees and was bidding on projects across Pennsylvania. The funeral home became a known landmark, the building where justice had been sealed away and finally released. The Historical Society asked to place a marker. A documentary crew spent 2 weeks filming the space, interviewing the families, telling Margaret's story. In December, on the anniversary of opening the sealed room, Elena stood in that space with Margaret's journal open to the final entry. I don't know if this evidence will ever matter, or if I sealed it away for nothing. But I know that truth doesn't expire, even if statutes do. Someone will find this. Someone will care. That has to be enough. Elena had written her own entry below it. It was enough. The families know what happened. Your name is cleared. The work you did 43 years ago changed everything for 17 families and a woman who thought she'd lost her last chance. Thank you for trusting me with this. She closed the journal and placed it in the restored filing cabinet, now part of a permanent archive that the county library had agreed to house. The documents would be preserved, accessible, part of the public record. The sealed room would remain her bedroom, but its history would never be forgotten. That evening, Elena walked through the completed funeral home, offices on the first floor, her apartment on the second, workshop and storage on the third. The building was warm, solid, alive again. She'd paid off the emergency roof repair debt. Her savings account had climbed to $18,400, built back up through her own labor and business profits. She'd been approved for a business line of credit, for equipment loans, for things that had seemed impossible during those nights in the Walmart parking lot. She made dinner in her small kitchen, looking out over Ashford's main street with its slowly revitalizing downtown, the empty storefronts starting to fill with small businesses drawn by lower rent, and the town's growing reputation for community resilience. Elena's restoration work had brought attention, had shown what was possible when you refused to abandon what others called worthless. Her phone buzzed with a text from David Ortiz. 3 more families reached out today. Different mine, different company, similar fraud patterns from the 1980s. They heard about Ashford. They're asking if you have space in that filing room for new evidence. I told them you'd built your whole business on preservation. Was I right? Elena looked at the sealed room turned bedroom, at the filing cabinets now empty but ready, and smiled. She'd been called crazy for buying a condemned funeral home, for believing that a rotting building in a dying town could be transformed into something valuable. She'd been right about the building. She'd been right about the hidden room. She'd been right about what truth was worth, even 43 years late. She typed her response, "Tell them I'm ready. And tell them the room stays sealed until the evidence is complete. Some things are worth protecting, no matter how long it takes." Elena set down her phone and returned to the window, watching evening settle over Ashford. The town that was supposed to be finished, in the building that was supposed to be demolished, housing evidence that was supposed to stay buried. All of it written off as worthless by people who didn't understand that value wasn't measured in market assessments or immediate returns. It was measured in what you built from the ruins, in the truths you refused to abandon, in the justice you delivered to people who'd been told to give up and move on. Elena had been evicted from her life in Philadelphia, and it had led her here, to Margaret's 43-year act of resistance, to 17 families finally compensated, to a restoration business built on the principle that nothing was worthless if you cared enough to save it. She'd been broken down to nothing in that truck in the Walmart parking lot. But the person who'd survived those nights was the same person standing in this restored funeral home, running a successful business, preserving evidence for families who deserved truth. The money in her savings account mattered less than the work itself, than the buildings she was saving, than the families whose stories she was helping to tell. Margaret had known that, had sealed the truth away and waited for someone who would understand that some things were worth more than immediate profit or easy comfort. Elena understood. She learned it in the cold of homelessness, in the dusty silence of a condemned building, in the moment she'd opened a sealed door and found 43 years of stubborn, careful resistance. The funeral home had been called worthless. They'd called her crazy for buying it. They'd been wrong about both.